Europe breathes heavily, like an old beast before a leap. The air is thick with fear, newspaper headlines, and the silence of politicians who still pretend that war can be avoided. But everyone knows something is coming. Germany, humiliated after the First World War, has long since stopped being defeated. It is rearming. Its industries roar at full power. Factories churn out tanks, planes, and artillery. On the streets of Berlin, red flags with black swastikas wave in the wind. Hitler's voice echoes from every radio. The people listen. They believe. They applaud. Adolf Hitler appears calm, confident, even gentle in his speeches. He talks about peace, about protecting Germans abroad. But every phrase he utters is a calculated step toward his next move. After swallowing Austria and Czechoslovakia, only one obstacle remains between Germany and its Lebensraum in the east, Poland. By August 1939, the diplomatic channels are burning. Berlin sends notes to Warsaw, London pleads for calm, and Moscow silently prepares its own game. Along the western Polish border, German divisions stand ready. On the roads, long military convoys disguised as training maneuvers. Everything is in place, except for one thing: a reason for war. The birth of a lie. At Gestapo headquarters on Prinz Albrecht Strasse in Berlin, the highest-ranking SS officers gather: Himmler, Heydrich, Müller. Gray shadows on a black background of impending catastrophe. Himmler speaks first, his voice cold and sharp. The Führer must not appear as the aggressor. We must show that Poland struck first. Heydrich nods. In his hands, a folder marked in black ink, Unternehmen Himmler, Operation Himmler. Inside, a series of plans for fake Polish attacks that will justify invasion. One location stands out, the radio station in the border town of Gleiwitz, a small regional transmitter building broadcasting to the local area. The perfect stage for a provocation. Close enough to Poland to blame them, German enough that people will believe it. The propaganda machine. Days before the planned operation, German newspapers start their campaign. Headlines scream: Poles preparing attacks on Germans. Polish nationalists brutalize civilians. Radio, newspapers, posters, all working in unison. The German public is being conditioned, primed to accept the idea of a Polish threat. They only need one final proof, a single incident. That proof will be created by men in the shadows. The executors. In the middle of the night, at a secret base near Oppeln, a small SS commando unit is assembled. Their commander, Alfred Naujax, an Abwehr agent and Heydrich's trusted operative. He receives his final orders: strike on August 31. The goal: seize the Gleiwitz radio station, broadcast a short message in Polish, leave behind evidence, and disappear. That evidence will be the bodies of concentration camp prisoners, men chosen at random, mostly Poles or those without papers. They are injected with poison, dressed in Polish uniforms, and loaded onto trucks. They do not know they are about to become proof of a fake war. Himmler trusts no one, not even his own officers. All orders go through Heydrich, cold, calculating, merciless. He oversees every detail: uniforms, weapons, timing, even the words of the radio broadcast. It must look real, he says to Naujax. No one must doubt it was a Polish attack. Everyone understands what's at stake. This is not a mere propaganda stunt. This is the trigger for war. August 1939. German newspapers fill with reports of border provocations. In Berlin, the public is prepared for mobilization. Schools recite patriotic poems. The phrase Polish aggression becomes common speech. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is signed, dividing Eastern Europe between two dictators. Poland's fate is sealed, though it doesn't yet know it. A quiet, provincial town. People listen to the radio, drink beer in local pubs, unaware that their modest transmitter will soon become the spark for the greatest war in human history. The station is a small brick building with a tall antenna surrounded by trees. Inside, a few engineers work the night shift. Nothing unusual, just another summer evening. August 30. Now Jocks receives the final message. The code phrase for execution. The cans are open. It means the prisoners are ready. At 1900 on August 31, a truck will stop by the station. 6 armed men in Polish uniforms will storm the building. They will broadcast a short message in Polish. Poland stands against Germany. Long live Poland! Then they will leave the bodies of the attackers at the entrance. It will be over in minutes. In the corridors of power. At the Reich Chancellery, Hitler holds his final meeting. His eyes shine. "We begin at dawn," he says, "but the world must see that we merely answered aggression." He no longer wants peace. He wants justification. He wants history to record him not as a conqueror, but as a defender of the Reich. Within hours, the world will change forever. The last day of August passes quietly. People return home from work, listen to the radio, read the newspapers. No one suspects that within hours, Europe will ignite. The sun sets over Berlin, bleeding red light into the sky. In the barracks, soldiers clean their rifles. In command rooms, maps of Poland lie open under dim lamps. On the highways, lines of tanks, engines humming softly, waiting for dawn. In a dark basement near Oppeln, now Jocks checks his weapon. His face is calm, but his hands tremble slightly. He knows that within hours his name will be written into history, a history that many will try to erase. At 1800, Himmler receives the coded message, "Operation Ready, commence at 2000." At the same time, in London, Prime Minister Chamberlain prepares a speech pleading for peace. In Moscow, Stalin reads reports from the West. He knows his time will come soon. Prelude to catastrophe. Everything converges on one point: a small town, a small building, a handful of men. A single event that will set the world ablaze. When night falls over Europe, the world will never be the same again. As August faded into the night of the 31st, a plan conceived in secret reached its final hour. In Berlin, decisions were already made, messages dispatched, and the machinery of deception fully engaged. The operation had a single purpose: to fabricate an attack by Poland that would justify the German invasion. Everything depended on illusion and timing. A small unit of operatives, hand-picked and trained for secrecy, prepared to carry out the orders. They understood the weight of their task. The world would see them as aggressors from the outside, but in truth they were agents of manipulation. Among them, Alfred Najocks bore the responsibility of precision. He knew the consequences, not just for those involved, but for millions yet unaware of what was about to begin. The operation was simple in design, but devastating in effect. Its success depended on creating evidence that Poland had initiated hostilities. Dead men dressed in enemy uniforms, a short broadcast in Polish, a staged attack. Enough to convince observers and the press that aggression had come from across the border. Nothing more was needed. The rest would follow. By dawn, Berlin would have its justification, Hitler his excuse, and Europe its ignition point. The pact with Moscow ensured that Germany could act with impunity in the East. Poland, isolated and unaware, would face the first blows of a conflict that would soon engulf the world. September 1st, 1939. The world awoke to the sound of engines, marching boots, and the certainty of violence. Germany had crossed the border into Poland. What had begun as a staged provocation the night before now became the undeniable reality of war. The pretext, the fabricated attacks on the Gleiwitz radio station and other minor incidents, had given Hitler the justification he needed. The invasion was swift, calculated, and merciless. Poland, caught between two powers, struggled to respond. Its army, brave but outmatched, faced mechanized divisions, coordinated airstrikes, and overwhelming firepower. The aggression was not only military but psychological. The suddenness of the assault, the propaganda broadcast in the prior hours, and the global confusion created chaos among civilians and soldiers alike. Families fled, cities braced, and the world watched, some in disbelief, some in muted horror. Europe reacted with words rather than action. Britain and France, bound by treaties, issued ultimatums. Diplomats hurried to deliver messages that would determine the fate of nations. Yet the military might of Germany had already established a new reality on the ground. Poland was under siege, and the gears of total war began to turn. Meanwhile, the architects of the deception in Berlin observed the results with careful satisfaction. Their operation had achieved exactly what it was meant to, an appearance of justification. The narrative was set. The aggressor portrayed himself as the defender, and the world, initially confused, began to accept it. The invasion marked the beginning of a conflict unprecedented in scale and cruelty. It was the opening of a war that would consume millions, reshape borders, and redefine power. The night of deception in Gleiwitz had ignited more than just a military campaign. It had ignited the conscience of the world, challenging the notion of truth, justice, and the consequences of manipulation. History would later measure battles, strategies, and losses, but few would fully grasp the quiet orchestration behind the first act. The beginning of the war in Poland was more than a military maneuver. It was a lesson in how carefully constructed lies can unleash forces that spiral far beyond anyone's control. The first day of the invasion ended with the certainty that Europe's peace was gone forever. The shadow of 1939 stretched across the continent, carrying with it the weight of destruction, fear, and the inevitability of escalation. The invasion of Poland sent ripples across the globe. For weeks, diplomats had hoped for restraint, for negotiation, for some form of compromise that would prevent the catastrophe everyone feared. Yet on September 1st, those hopes were shattered. Germany's aggression was clear and undeniable, and the world was forced to confront the reality of war. In London, the British government convened emergency meetings. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who had once spoken of peace and appeasement, now faced the limits of diplomacy. The promises made to Poland were binding, but the challenge was immense. Military mobilization had to be swift, coordination with allies meticulous, and public morale maintained. Yet, despite words of warning and condemnation, the ability to stop Germany's advance immediately was beyond reach. France, bound by treaties and memories of 1914-1918, echoed the call for action. The government urged Germany to withdraw, to honor international law, and to respect the sovereignty of its neighbor. But these statements, no matter how firm, could not halt the tanks, the aircraft, or the disciplined divisions sweeping across Polish plains. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Soviet Union watched silently. Stalin had negotiated his own pact with Hitler weeks earlier. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement had divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. From Moscow's perspective, the German invasion was not a surprise, but a signal, a prelude to the Soviets' eventual actions in the East. Calculations were being made in quiet rooms, strategies crafted in shadows, and the balance of power in Europe was shifting without public notice. In the United States and other neutral nations, the news provoked anxiety and disbelief. Headlines screamed of aggression and betrayal. Editorials debated intervention, neutrality, and the potential for a global conflict. Yet, for many, Europe felt distant, and the true scale of what was unfolding was not yet comprehensible. For Poland, the world's delayed reaction was painfully evident. Soldiers faced overwhelming odds, civilians confronted the realities of occupation, and leaders realized that treaties and promises offered little protection against the machinery of war. The diplomatic shockwaves were immediate, but ultimately insufficient to prevent devastation. By the end of the first week, it was clear. Europe was at war. Nations could no longer speak only in words. Action would be demanded, alliances tested, and the consequences of decades-long tensions would unfold in brutal, unforgiving ways. The invasion of Poland was not just a military act, it was the moment when diplomacy failed, and the world had to reckon with the inevitable, a conflict that would engulf nations, redraw borders, and claim millions of lives. The operation that began as a staged provocation now defined the first chapter of World War II. Its echoes reverberated not only across Poland and Germany, but throughout the capitals of the world. The fragile balance of peace, so carefully maintained for decades, had been shattered, and there was no turning back. The invasion of Poland did not just ignite conflict, it transformed the very fabric of Europe. Within hours, the reality of occupation, resistance, and mobilization began to unfold. For Poland, the immediate challenge was survival. Soldiers, civilians, and leaders alike faced an enemy whose strength and coordination were unparalleled. Every city, every town, every village became a potential front in a war that had been thrust upon them without warning. The Polish military responded with courage and strategy, but the odds were stark. Mechanized divisions and aerial bombardments advanced relentlessly. Communication lines were disrupted, supplies dwindled, and the civilian population faced both displacement and terror. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming force, pockets of resistance emerged, units that refused to surrender, communities that aided one another, and a nation determined to hold its identity and sovereignty against a tide of aggression. Beyond Poland, Germany's actions triggered the chain reaction across Europe. Britain and France, bound by mutual defense treaties and obligations, accelerated mobilization. Armies were readied, plans revised, and governments prepared to act decisively. The recognition that appeasement had failed crystallized in real time, forcing nations to confront the stark reality of war. The world was awakening to the fact that diplomacy alone could not restrain the ambitions of a totalitarian regime. The rapid escalation also had profound psychological and social effects. Fear, uncertainty, and anxiety spread as families awaited news of soldiers at the front. Refugees fled advancing forces, and communities adjusted to the reality that no place was untouched by the looming conflict. Propaganda intensified, with governments using media to shape perception, sustain morale, and justify the difficult choices now imposed by war. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the architects of the invasion watched the results with satisfaction. Their carefully orchestrated deception, the staged attacks, the falsified justifications had achieved its purpose. They had manipulated perception and created the narrative of a defensive war, while the machinery of aggression rolled inexorably forward. Yet even they could not foresee the full scale of the devastation their actions would set in motion. The world now faced a dual challenge, confronting an immediate military threat and grappling with the broader implications of a conflict that would define the decade. The invasion of Poland was both a spark and a mirror, reflecting the vulnerabilities of nations, the limits of treaties, and the consequences of a world unprepared for the magnitude of aggression. In retrospect, the first weeks of the conflict revealed a hard truth. Wars are rarely sudden. They are the culmination of planning, deception, ambition, and miscalculation. Poland's resistance, the mobilization of allies, and the responses of distant nations were all chapters in a story that had been quietly written long before the first shot was fired. The consequences of August and September 1939 would resonate for years to come, shaping strategy, politics, and the lives of millions across continents. As September unfolded, the war in Poland quickly revealed its true scale. The initial invasion had been only the beginning. German forces advanced with precision, overwhelming resistance, capturing towns, and establishing control over strategic regions. Yet what began as a localized conflict rapidly became a continental crisis. The mechanisms of aggression that had been set in motion in Berlin were now unstoppable in practice, and the ramifications extended far beyond Poland's borders. Allies mobilized. Britain and France, having declared war, faced the daunting reality of limited immediate action. Their armies readied, their navies patrolled, and their governments sought strategies to confront Germany while grappling with internal political pressures and public fear. The early days revealed both strengths and weaknesses in coordination, intelligence, and preparations. For the first time since 1918, Europe confronted a war that would not be limited, a war that required total engagement from all involved nations. In Poland, the human toll mounted rapidly. Cities burned, transportation networks were destroyed, and civilians bore the brunt of invasion. Refugees poured into safer regions, while soldiers fought desperately to slow the advance of mechanized divisions. The determination of the Polish people was fierce, but the imbalance of power was staggering. The country faced not only military defeat, but also the systemic occupation and suppression that would define the coming months. Beyond Europe, the consequences were immediate. Neutral nations watched anxiously as the conflict expanded, recognizing the threat posed by a rapidly rearming Germany. Diplomatic channels buzzed with negotiation, concern, and calculation. The invasion was not an isolated event. It was a signal that the continent's fragile peace had collapsed, and that alliances, treaties, and political guarantees were insufficient to prevent aggression. The propaganda machinery in Berlin continued to operate. The narrative of a defensive Germany, responding to external provocation, was reinforced at home and presented to the world. Yet the truth was undeniable. Germany had engineered the conflict and pursued it with deliberate speed and efficiency. The full-scale escalation demonstrated the combination of strategy, deception, and ruthless planning that defined Hitler's approach to conquest. By the end of September, the war had assumed a new character. It was no longer a matter of borders or isolated clashes. It was a conflict that demanded global attention. Europe's nations were compelled to act, strategize, and prepare for the long struggle ahead. The invasion of Poland had become the opening chapter of a broader story, a story of mechanized armies, political manipulation, and a world unprepared for the scope of the coming conflict. History would later examine the first weeks as a prelude to total war. The escalation revealed not only the immediate impact on Poland, but also the vulnerabilities of Europe's political and military systems. The machinery set in motion in Berlin could not be reversed, and the expansion of conflict was inevitable. The seeds sown in August and September 1939 now bore the fruit of destruction, setting a precedent for the years to come. By the closing months of 1939, Europe had been irrevocably transformed. The invasion of Poland, orchestrated with calculated precision, had accomplished far more than a military objective. It had demonstrated the power of deception, propaganda, and rapid mobilization in modern warfare. The carefully staged provocation at Gleiwitz, intended to justify German aggression, had unleashed a chain reaction of unprecedented magnitude, altering the political, social, and military landscape across the continent. The immediate consequence was Poland's devastation. Cities had been razed, transportation networks destroyed, and the civilian population subjected to fear, displacement, and violence. The Polish military, though valiant, had been overwhelmed by the superior mechanization and coordination of the German forces. Resistance persisted in pockets, but the momentum of the invasion was unstoppable. For Poland, the war was no longer abstract. It was a lived reality of occupation, survival, and national trauma. Every village, every town, every family bore the burden of a conflict engineered far from their own homes, yet imposed upon them with brutal immediacy. Across Western Europe, the impact was both political and psychological. Britain and France, having declared war on Germany, faced the dual challenges of preparing their military forces while navigating the constraints of domestic politics and public opinion. The declarations of war had little immediate effect on the battlefield, but they marked a shift in the global balance of power. Governments that had hoped to contain Hitler diplomatically were forced to recognize that the age of appeasement had ended. The realization spread quickly. Total war had begun, and there would be no turning back.
Diplomatic reactions were diverse and complex. In Moscow, Stalin observed with cold calculation. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had secured a temporary alignment between the Soviet Union and Germany, allowing Stalin to prepare his own expansionist moves in the East while maintaining a facade of neutrality to the wider world. In Washington, D.C., policymakers debated intervention, economic sanctions, and the implications of a European war on global trade and security. Across neutral countries, anxiety and uncertainty pervaded, as the inevitability of conflict cast a shadow over previously stable nations. The operation itself, Gleiwitz, and the other staged provocations achieved exactly what its architects intended. Hitler's Germany had crafted a narrative, an aggressor disguised as a defender, a preemptive strike framed as a righteous response. Propaganda machines amplified the illusion, creating a perception that aligned with German political objectives. In reality, the invasion had been planned meticulously, with forethought, precision, and chilling disregard for human life. Those who executed the plan, the operatives, the SS officers, and the agents, carried out their duties with efficiency, understanding that history would remember the results, if not the method. Ultimately, the events of 1939, from the carefully orchestrated provocations at Gleiwitz to the sweeping invasions and the international response, exemplified the delicate and dangerous interplay of strategy, politics, and human behavior. They demonstrated that war is not solely the product of battlefield engagements, but also of planning, perception management, and the calculated use of misinformation. The invasion of Poland and its subsequent consequences marked the beginning of a period in which the scale of human suffering, the speed of military operations, and the complexity of political maneuvering would reach unprecedented levels. The legacy of that year is profound. It is a testament to the fragility of peace, the potency of propaganda, and the devastating power of calculated aggression. The first months of World War II taught the world that conflict can be engineered, justified, and executed with efficiency, leaving in its wake consequences that reverberate far beyond the immediate theater of war. Gleiwitz and Poland were not merely locations or events, they were symbols of how modern warfare begins. Quietly, deliberately, and with consequences that no one could fully anticipate. History remembers the battles, the alliances, and the strategies, but it is the orchestration of events, the human decisions made in shadowed rooms, and the consequences of deception that define the true narrative. The final lesson of 1939 is stark and unyielding. Wars begin not only with force, but with planning, manipulation, and the deliberate shaping of perception. And once set in motion, they often follow a course that no individual or nation can fully control.